One of the first steps to answering the question, how much and how long, is to answer the question, how big is it? One way to express that answer is in what are called story points or just points. A lot of people size their backlog items simply using t-shirt sizes because the accuracy that they require is adequately served by simply classifying their work as small, medium, large, extra large. That's all the gradient that they require to determine how much and how long. But for many of us, that's not adequate, and especially if someone is asking us the question, how much work is there in the backlog? It's not a satisfying answer for a lot of people to say, well, there's 5 medium stories and 13 large stories. They want to have some number that expresses, yes, there's this much work in the backlog. So rather than expressing our work in t-shirt sizes, we might want to be able to express how big a backlog item is in terms of what are called points. And this is very much like the t-shirt size. It's a relative size. It's simply comparing one story to another. If we call a story a 5-point story, then that 5-point story in terms of its complexity, its effort, and uncertainty looks a lot like the other 5-point stories. And the 13-point stories, it looks like other 13-point stories. And it's about 3 times as big or 2.5 times as big as the 5-point stories. So this is, there's some consistency in the way that we assigned these numbers as the representative of the size of the story. But this is how we can express it's still relative sizing. Now, in the Agile world, a lot of people recommend using the Fibonacci sequence, and I make the same recommendation. So the way that we assign points to a story is based on this sequence. So stories can be 1, 2, 3, 5, and it simply means if you give a story a 1 point, then a 2-point story is roughly twice as big. A 3-point story is about a time and a half as big as a 2. The 5 is kind of almost twice as big as a 3. You get the general idea that there's a certain consistency and logic to this sequence in the way we apply it. The reason you'll notice also it's not an exact Fibonacci sequence. It goes 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 20. The next number should be 21, but it's modified at this point, then it just goes 20, 40, 100. So this is by convention what most Agilists or people using story points would advise. What's key here is the reason we use the Fibonacci sequence, it has a nice progression. There's clearly a difference between 1 and 2, 2 and 3, 3 and 5. You can see that, yes, a 5-point story is clearly much larger than a 3, but much smaller than an 8. Some people have tried to use linear sequences like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay, at the early part, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, yeah, there's a significant difference. You can tell the difference between a 3 and a 4 maybe. But it starts getting kind of iffy as you're going, what's the difference between a 7 and an 8 or a 9 and a 10? The difference is so fuzzy at that point and so insignificant compared to your ability to estimate that it's not worth it. So I strongly recommend the Fibonacci sequence because you can clearly distinguish what the difference is between, let's say, a 3-point story and a 5-point story. Some people have also suggested using like an exponential sequence, like a 1, 2, 4, 16, but clearly that rises way too fast. The progression is far too fast in that to be useful as a mechanism for sizing stories. So yeah, the Fibonacci sequence, by convention, seems to be the most practical and useful for story sizing. So the way we're still doing relative sizing and the numbers work the way that we expect them. We're comparing, let's say, a new story, and what we're doing is we're asking, how is this story like the other one? So here's a new story. And we've got three other stories there. We've got a story that's representative of 5, we've got a story that's representative of 3 and 8. And we're really asking the question in terms of effort, complexity, and uncertainty. Does this news story we have look more like a 3? Does it look more like a 5? Does it look more like an 8? And there are a number of ways that the team can come to consensus on answering that question. A lot of people like to play planning poker to do that, to get the judgment of the team. Does the news story look more like an example of what we call a 3, or more like an example of what we call a 5, or more like an example of what we call an 8? Or maybe we can't come to a consensus. But the idea is still we're using our historical data as expressed by the existing stories to understand how big is the news story. So the team might finally come to the conclusion that, yeah, this news story looks more like that 8. So therefore this news story is also an 8. So now, when the product owner here comes and asks our business analyst, how much work is there in the backlog, he's able to provide a quantitative answer and say, yes, there are 120 points of work in our product backlog. And that, for a lot of people, having a quantitative value for the amount of work in the backlog is a very satisfying answer.